After the death of his first wife, and after the publishing of Notes from the Underground, Dostoevsky found himself in a very, very difficult, not to say desperate situation, for many different reasons. Of course, perhaps the most important kind of reasons were psychological. He was very upset at the loss of his wife. He had a stepson in his hand who gave him terrible troubles, and no matter how he tried to deal with it, what he got was only grief from this young man, for whose welfare, after all, he felt himself morally responsible. And then he had made an arrangement with his brother to start a journal in Russia, a journal that dealt with political and literary problems and cultural problems of the day. The journal had just gotten started and was underway when, through a misunderstanding, the censor stopped the publication of the journal completely, and Dostoevsky and his brother were saddled with enormous debts that they had no way of paying because, of course, the journal wasn't being published and there was no income. And to make matters even worse, the brother died while this was in the process, and Dostoevsky felt himself morally committed to paying off these debts in spite of the fact that they had really been made in the name of his brother. So that he found himself desperate no matter which way he turned. He was desperate for money, he was desperate for affection, he was desperate for company, he was desperate to figure out how to deal with this stepson of his, and then, of course, to make matters even worse, the intellectuals toward whom he looked and for whom he had, after all, some kind of respect, were increasingly distant from him because they felt that Dostoevsky had gone away from the beliefs of his youth, that he was a kind of a turncoat that they couldn't deal with, so that in spite of the fact that he tried to turn toward them, often they turned away from him, or if they did come to him, they wanted to do things in a way that he totally did not want to do. It was a difficult time, and of course, if you read some of the things that they wrote about each other at that time, you realize that almost anybody would have found it almost impossible to deal with the situation that he had. What to do? Finally, in desperation, he turned to a publisher who was well known at that time, a man by the name of Stylovsky, explained his predicament and asked for help. Stylovsky had considerable respect for Dostoevsky's talent. Dostoevsky's reputation was very strong at that point. He said, look, I will pay your debts. I will give you a contract where you'll be able to live for 2 years, you'll be debt-free, and in turn, you will promise me to deliver a manuscript of certain length by 2 years from the date of the signing of this contract. Length was determined in those days by what they called sewn notebooks, which were 8 pages of stapled or sewn together. And of course, it was done by hand, naturally. And you measured the length of the manuscript by the number of notebooks that would be submitted. Dostoevsky agreed to submit a certain number of notebooks that would turn into a novel that Stylovsky could publish. Now, said Stylovsky, if you do not deliver that manuscript of that length at that time, then I will take not only the rights to everything you've published in the past, but to everything that you will publish in the future. In short, if that happened, Dostoevsky would really be his slave. Well, it was not a very comfortable situation to be in, but Dostoevsky thought it was the only way to get out of the mess. He signed the contract. And, naturally, time went by. Now, I will give you one guess of what had been done by the time 1 year and 11 months had passed by. If you, as you probably did, guess 0, you would be absolutely right. He had not one single word written, and he was desperate. He turned to his friends what to do, how to get out of this situation, which seemed even worse than before he signed the contract. Well, they said, you know, Stendhal, the famous French writer, and by the way, a writer who had enormous influence in Russia at that time, although he wasn't well known in the West yet, that came later. Stendhal had written a masterpiece called The Charterhouse of Parma by dictating it to a stenographer. It's hard to believe, but he dictated 40 pages a day for something well over a month. And what came out was a very strong masterpiece, a novel that eventually had influence all over the world, and people read with enormous attraction and pleasure. And now, of course, Russia in those days followed very closely what was done in France. They said, we have set up in Russia schools of stenography just like they have in France. Young women who are trained to take dictation no matter how fast you talk. Why don't you try to get one of the women from the Moscow School of Stenography to whom you can dictate the novel? They said, are you crazy? I can't dictate these things. They said, well, look, what's the alternative? Okay, let's try it. So they looked for the best student in that institute, who turned out to be a young woman by the name of Anna Grigorievna Snitkina. As you can tell from the last name, it's not purely Russian. The family was of Swedish origin, but had been, like many such people, had been in Russia for several generations. She was a total Russian. So this young woman, Anna Grigorievna, came to take dictation. According to what Dostoevsky said and what she later said, for 2 days he paced the room back and forth. He began by giving her a sort of examination. Are you a blue stocking? Are you an atheist? Do you smoke cigarettes? You can imagine how well that went down. But she stuck it out, and after 2 days of walking back and forth, unable to say one word, suddenly it started pouring out. And in the course of exactly the amount of time, I guess that would be 28 days, he managed to finish the novel, which actually a novella, eventually called The Gambler. And it was done the way it was supposed to be done. She sat, listened, took dictation, faithfully brought back a clean copy the next day for correction. On exactly the day, they took the manuscript to Dostoevsky. Well, now, as you can probably guess, Dostoevsky was no fool. He knew what was going on very well, so he arranged on that day to close the office and to be out of town. So Dostoevsky couldn't deliver the manuscript. So instead, they went to the police station and got a notarized statement that they had delivered the manuscript. There was a lawsuit, which Dostoevsky won. And so he was out of the contract, and of course he had the money. Well, what does a Russian do? On an occasion like that, you throw a banquet. That's what you do. That's known then. It's known today. A Russian banquet is a real banquet. Well, naturally, Dostoevsky invited his friends, and out of sheer politeness, of course, he invited Anna Grigorievna. After all, she had played a major role in finishing this manuscript. And when they were in the course of the banquet, he said to her, Anna Grigorievna, I'd like to ask you a question. She said, well, certainly, Fyodor Mikhailovich, what is it? He said, well, I'd like to get your advice. I am starting a new novel, and in this novel, a somewhat older man has been attracted to a somewhat younger woman. And now this man is a terrible man. He's spent time in prison. He's been in chains. He has a terrible temperament. To live with him would not be easy. He's capable of love. He has a certain amount of talent, but I assure you, in many ways, he's a terrible person. Do you think that if this man would make a proposal to the younger woman, I could make it come off as believable in the novel? And I suppose you've already guessed her answer. She said, I accept your proposal. This was the beginning of the second marriage, which was really quite a remarkable thing. Anna Grigorievna, it was no lie when he said she was going to have to put up some really terrible times with him. It was very, very difficult for her. There were times when even physically he almost threatened her. There was, as a matter of fact, one time when he almost tore a chain right off her neck because he believed quite untruly that she'd been, or that she was giving attention to other men. There were times when he lost her money, her mother's money, her brother's money. He engaged in all kinds of things, not to mention, of course, the tortures that the stepson put them through. But through all of this, she stuck with him, and I honestly think it would have been impossible for him to have written his genuine masterpieces without her. Had she not been there, I'm really very skeptical that he would have been able to do what he did, and it's quite legitimate that the beginning of the Brothers Karamazov, that last great novel of Dostoevsky, the dedication is Посвящается Anne Grigorievne Dostoevskoy. This is dedicated to Anna Grigorievna Dostoevskaya. It's really quite a remarkable story. Alas, her end was also very sad. At the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, she outlived him, of course, by quite a few years because she was 20 years younger than he was. He died in 1881. She lived up to 1917. At that time, of course, the economy of the country was totally upset, and she was in a place where there was virtually no food. There was a terrible famine, and for a whole week, she had nothing to eat. And then all of a sudden somebody found out who she was, and through some kind of machinations managed to get a loaf of freshly baked bread. It was still hot. She was so ravenous, she fell on it ravenously, and it killed her. The bread, of course, expanded in her stomach. She didn't survive. So this was one more victim of the Bolshevik Revolution. Very sad end to a really remarkable woman who, in addition to everything else, was very much responsible for the publication of all of Dostoevsky's works. Now, Dostoevsky suffered from the gambling addiction. Now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of the story here, but of course this fits in. He had a terrible gambling obsession, so bad that he would go to the casinos of Western Europe, particularly at Wiesbaden, which in The Gambler he called Roulettenberg. And in the first place, he lost all his money. And he promised Anna Grigorievna, if she'd just given a little money, he'd come back. And she gave him the money. Of course, he lost that money. He lost all of her money. He lost all of her brother's money. He lost all of her mother's money. And then he sat down and wrote The Idiot. She knew that he had to go through this in order to write the novel, and she put up with it. This gives you some idea of what she went through. Now, gambling was not the only obsession that Dostoevsky became concerned with that attracted his imagination. There was also the problem of drinking. Alcohol was and still is a terrible problem in Russia, and of course in the Soviet Union as well. I actually observed this with my own eyes in some terrible ways. And the problem was, how did you deal with drunkenness? Where did it come from? What was the nature of it? How to do something with it? We got a little bit of taste of this in what we talked about before in Poor Folk. You remember the old man Bakrovsky, who had been a drunkard. Dostoevsky, that he would write a story called, well, in Russian, pyaninkiya. That's to say, dear little drunkards. A drunken person is a pyanny, so pyaninkiya is this marvelous diminutives in the Russian language. It was going to be a novel called The Dear Little Drunkards, and the major character was going to be named Marmeladov. Of course, Marmeladov in Russian is connected with the word marmalade. That is something very sweet and sticky and soft with no center, but very sweet. And the major character in the novel was scheduled to be Marmeladov. Dostoevsky placed him in a very cheap tavern, a Russian bar called a kabak, where the smell alone would knock you down, not to mention the smell of the bread and everything that went with it. And as he's sitting in the tavern, muttering about the terrible circumstances of his life, how he's ruined the life of his family, he's ruined the life of his own daughter, he's ruined the life of some stepchildren whom he has, a young man walks in, a young student, and somehow attracts the attention of Marmeladov and notices Marmeladov. This young man has a name that most of you, I'm sure, will recognize, Raskolnikov, which is a marvelous name in Russian, because Raskol in Russian is the word for schism, the kind of division that takes place in a church. So Raskolnikov means from among the schismatics. It's a perfect appellation for the protagonist of this tale, who of course is going to become the center of attention. Now in this scene, Raskolnikov has managed to drag himself out of his tiny, well, it's called a kamorka. It's like a ship's cabin in St. Petersburg. When he lies on the bed, he can extend his arm and almost touch the wall on the other side. I've been in such a bed, in such a room in Petersburg. I know what it feels like. I've lived in such a room, although he didn't have a telephone the way I did. And of course, a terrible obsession has been taking over him while he's in this room, an obsession that somehow or other he has to commit a murder in order to not only make a career for himself, but carry out charity and philanthropy among human beings of the entire world. He has a growing obsession that he's some kind of Napoleon who's not subject to the laws of society around him. The title, Crime and Punishment, crime in Russian, the word is prestuplение, which means literally stepping across. A more literal English translation would be the word transgression, which of course comes from Latin of stepping across. The idea being that normal people live within certain boundaries of rules, but there are certain exceptional people who can step across, who can violate these rules and do nothing wrong because they are the Napoleons of this world, the Mohammeds of this world. He's got this terrible obsession, and of course he's gone out to get some air. He hasn't paid any attention to his studies for a long time. And in the course of his wanderings, he's run across this tavern where on an impulse he goes in, and he meets Marmeladov. And Marmeladov pours out a terrible tale of what's happened to his family. He was a government clerk, and he had a decent boss. The boss realized that he was a terrible alcoholic, but the boss let him come back. He said, look, I'm going to give you another chance. His family, his second wife, he is the second husband of Katerina Ivanovna, who loyally sticks by him, although she's a sort of a half-crazy woman herself, and has children from previous marriage. They've set him up with good coffee, with decent clothing. He's been given a large advance from the boss. He goes to work. He carries out his work. He comes home. He leaves the money for his family. And then, while they're all asleep, he sneaks over, grabs the money, goes out, and blows it entirely on vodka.